To understand what it means to be lost in the warp is to grasp that every voyage through the immaterium represents a calculated gamble against forces that predate human civilization by eons. The warp itself exists as a parallel dimension of pure psychic energy, a roiling ocean of emotion and thought given terrible form. It serves as the medium through which faster-than-light travel becomes possible in the grim darkness of the far future, yet it remains fundamentally hostile to all physical life. Ships do not travel through the warp so much as they swim through an infinite sea of madness, protected only by technology that pushes back reality's nightmare reflection for as long as it can hold. The mechanics of warp travel depend upon three critical components working in perfect harmony. First, the warp drive itself tears a hole between dimensions, allowing a vessel to transition from real space into the immaterium. Second, the Geller field generates a bubble of reality around the ship, creating a protective envelope that keeps the hostile energies of the warp at bay. Third, a navigator uses their unique psychic gift to perceive the warp's impossible geometry and guide the vessel along its currents, while using the Astronomicon as a beacon. When even one of these elements fails, the consequences range from catastrophic to utterly inconceivable. The relationship between time in real space and time within the warp defies any rational understanding. A journey that should take weeks might conclude in mere hours, delivering a crew to their destination with memories of a short voyage, while centuries have passed outside. Conversely, what seems like a brief transit through the immaterium might stretch across months or years of subjective experience, while only days elapse in the material universe. The warp recognizes no linear progression of moments, no orderly march from past to future. Within its depths, time flows like water poured onto sand, seeping in unpredictable directions, pooling in impossible configurations, sometimes even running backward along channels that should not exist. Ships have emerged from the warp decades before they entered it, their crews arriving to witness events that have not yet occurred from their perspective. Others have returned to find that empires have risen and fallen, that the civilization they served has crumbled into dust, that everyone they knew died generations ago. The most extreme documented case involves a vessel that translated back into real space 20,000 years after entering the warp, its point of origin lost in the mists of the dark age of technology. Whatever archaeotech it carried was likely seized by the Adeptus Mechanicus, though whether such ancient systems could even be reverse-engineered remains unknown. For the crew who experienced perhaps only months aboard that benighted ship, they returned to find their entire universe transformed beyond recognition. This temporal instability makes warp travel fundamentally unpredictable, despite humanity's 10,000 years of experience traversing the immaterium. Navigators can plot courses based on known currents and established routes, yet the warp's nature ensures that no journey follows precisely the same path twice. Stable routes exist where traffic has worn channels through the psychic substrate, where the presence of the Astronomicon provides a reliable point of reference, where warp storms remain relatively quiescent. Even these supposedly safe passages carry risks that spacers have learned to accept as the price of travelling between the stars. The disappearance of ships in the warp occurs with such regularity that the Imperium accounts for it in its logistics planning. A certain percentage of vessels simply never emerge at their intended destinations. Some are lost to warp storms that tear ships apart with forces beyond mortal comprehension. Others drift off course into regions where the immaterium grows more turbulent, where the barrier between dimensions weakens, where things that should not exist press closer to reality. Still others suffer catastrophic Geller field failures, and what happens aboard those doomed vessels exists beyond the scope of most human imagination. The Geller field represents humanity's primary defense against the warp's hostile nature. This protective technology creates a bubble of real space around a ship, essentially carrying a fragment of normal reality into the immaterium itself. Within the field's boundaries, the physical laws that govern the material universe continue to apply. Gravity functions as expected. Time flows in recognizable patterns. The walls remain solid rather than dissolving into screaming faces. Most importantly, the entities that inhabit the warp cannot breach the field's protective envelope under normal circumstances. Modern Geller field generators often function through a grotesque necessity that highlights the Imperium's fundamental brutality. A psyker is placed in a state of permanent coma, their dreams of reality creating the actual field that protects the ship. In their unconscious state, these unfortunate souls project an aura of normalcy, a psychic bubble where the laws of physics remain constant. The dreaming psyker essentially imagines reality so intensely that it becomes temporarily real, pushing back the immaterium's chaos for the duration of the voyage. These psykers typically do not survive long, their life force gradually consumed by the effort of maintaining the field. Warp-capable vessels must carry reserves of comatose psykers to replace those who burn out during extended journeys, treating human beings as disposable batteries in service of the ship's survival. When a Geller field flickers, even for a single second, disaster follows immediately. The protective bubble of reality collapses, and the raw stuff of the warp floods into spaces meant for mortal habitation. What happens next depends on multiple factors, including the ship's location within the immaterium, the strength of psychic presences aboard the vessel, and the attention of entities that dwell in those impossible depths. In the best possible scenario, the field reactivates before catastrophic damage occurs, though even brief exposure to unfiltered warp energy leaves lasting scars on both ship and crew. Demons materialize throughout the vessel the instant the Geller field fails. These entities exist as fragments of the chaos gods themselves, sentient manifestations of emotion and thought given terrible purpose. They appear wherever the warp's energies can reach, clawing their way into reality with hunger that cannot be satisfied. The crew faces not merely death, but something far worse. Demons do not simply kill their victims. They consume souls, dragging the essential essence of a person back into the immaterium, where that consciousness will suffer torments beyond description for what might be eternity. Possession becomes commonplace as demonic entities take residence in mortal bodies, wearing human flesh like uncomfortable clothing while they wreak havoc throughout the ship. The physical structure of the vessel begins to warp and change under the immaterium's influence. Bulkheads twist into impossible configurations. Corridors stretch into infinity or compress into spaces that cannot accommodate three-dimensional forms. The metal of the hull itself sometimes grows semi-organic, developing orifices that scream or weep or laugh with disturbing human-like qualities. Crew members find themselves fused with walls, their bodies merging with the ship's structure in ways that leave them neither fully alive nor mercifully dead. Others transform as the warp's raw energy rewrites their biology on a fundamental level, forcing mutations that turn humans into things that bear only superficial resemblance to what they once were. Madness spreads faster than any plague. Exposure to the warp without protection assaults the psyche with visions and sensations that human minds were never meant to process. Crew members watch as reality itself becomes fluid and negotiable. They see impossible colours that exist nowhere in the normal spectrum. They hear sounds that bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the brain. Time loses all coherence, with moments stretching into subjective eternities while years pass in what feels like heartbeats. The rational mind, confronted with such fundamental violations of everything it understands about existence, simply breaks. Some descend into catatonia, others become homicidally violent, many begin worshipping the very entities that torment them, seeing in the chaos gods a terrible truth that supersedes the lies they were taught about reality's nature. For psychers aboard a ship when the Geller field fails, the experience becomes exponentially worse. These individuals exist with one foot already in the warp, their abilities allowing them to touch the immaterium even in real space. Without the field's protection, they become psychic beacons that draw demonic attention like blood in water attracts sharks. Possession occurs almost instantaneously as entities pour through the psychers' minds, using them as gateways to reach further into the ship. Many psychers' heads simply explode from the psychic pressure, their skulls unable to contain the forces that flood through their consciousness. Those who survive the initial shock often transform into conduits for demonic will, their own personalities subsumed beneath entities that view mortal life as little more than amusing playthings. Astropaths and navigators suffer particularly horrific fates. Astropaths who communicate across vast distances through the warp find themselves suddenly connected to every screaming voice in the immaterium simultaneously. The experience has been compared to trying to drink from a fire hose, except the water is composed of pure madness, and the pressure is infinite. Most astropaths subjected to this simply cease to function as coherent beings, their minds scattered across the warp in fragments that will never reassemble. Navigators, with their warp eye that allows them to perceive the immaterium directly, find that gift becomes an unbearable curse when the Geller field fails. They see the truth of what surrounds the ship, perceive the entities that hunger for mortal souls, comprehend the fundamental wrongness of the dimension through which they travel. Many navigators choose suicide rather than continue experiencing such visions, their final act a desperate attempt to escape awareness that cannot be endured. In some cases, tech priests manage to restore the Geller field before the ship is entirely lost. The bubble of reality snaps back into place, pushing the warp's energies back beyond the hull. But the respite comes too late for most of the crew. Those who survive the initial demonic incursion often carry corruption within them, seeds of chaos that will flower into betrayal or madness in time. The ship itself bears scars that no amount of repair can fully heal, sections where the warp's touch has left permanent marks. Strange phenomena plague these vessels for the remainder of their operational lives. Crew members report seeing movement in shadows that should not exist. Whispers echo through compartments that contain no one. The ship's machine spirit, if such a thing can be said to exist, becomes unstable and unreliable. When a Geller field fails completely and cannot be restored, the ship is effectively lost. It becomes a space hulk adrift in the warp, its crew either dead or transformed into something that no longer qualifies as human. The vessel might remain in the immaterium indefinitely, occasionally brushing against real space in unpredictable locations. These hulks represent terrible dangers to anyone unfortunate enough to encounter them. The demons that infested the ship during its death throes often remain, trapped within the hull's metal bones but still ravenously hungry. Boarding parties that attempt to salvage such vessels rarely return, and those who do come back changed in ways that necessitate their immediate execution. The Light of Terror serves as a particularly well-documented example of a ship that suffered Geller field failure and somehow survived. This battleship from the Angevin Crusade became trapped in a warp storm for over 1,000 years, its Geller field developing rents that allowed demonic intrusion but never failing entirely. A demon possessed a random crew member and committed murders across the decks for what must have seemed like an eternity to those trapped aboard. The navigators eventually killed themselves, unable to endure the psychic pressure of being lost in the warp for so long. Yet somehow, portions of the crew survived, establishing themselves as the tribes of terror within the belly of their cursed vessel. When the ship finally emerged from the immaterium, it carried descendants of the original crew who had known nothing but life aboard a haunted hulk drifting through dimensions where humanity was never meant to travel. Even when ships remain physically intact after a Geller field failure, their return to normal operations proves nearly impossible. The Inquisition takes immediate interest in any vessel that has experienced demonic incursion. Inquisitorial agents descend upon the ship, interrogating survivors, examining every compartment for signs of corruption, purging anyone deemed potentially tainted. In most cases, the Inquisition's verdict results in the entire crew being executed and the vessel itself destroyed or subjected to such extensive refitting that little of the original structure remains. The risk of allowing corrupted personnel or possessed ships to continue operating outweighs any value the vessel might have. Better to lose one ship than allow chaos a foothold that could spread to entire fleets. The psychological impact of experiencing even brief Geller field failure haunts survivors for the remainder of their lives. They have seen behind reality's curtain, glimpsed truths that the human mind evolved specifically to ignore. Many develop acute paranoia, seeing signs of demonic corruption in every shadow, suspecting possession in every unexpected action by their fellow crew members. Others become obsessed with understanding what they experienced, seeking forbidden knowledge about the warp and its inhabitants, despite the obvious dangers such research presents. Some lose all faith in the imperial creed, concluding that if gods exist, they are the chaos gods, and the emperor is either powerless or uncaring. These individuals often fall to chaos worship themselves, finding in the dark powers a terrible honesty that the Imperium's lies cannot match. But Geller field failure represents only one way a ship can become truly lost in the warp. Even with protective fields functioning perfectly, vessels can drift into regions where the immaterium becomes more dangerous, where stable currents give way to turbulent chaos, where the already tenuous connection to real space stretches to breaking. The warp contains its own geography, though the concept of geography becomes almost meaningless in a dimension where space itself flows like liquid. Certain areas remain relatively calm, well-travelled routes where countless ships have passed before, their passage leaving something like channels through the psychic substrate. Other regions writhe with constant upheaval, storms of pure emotion tearing through the warp's substance. capable of shredding any vessel that wanders into their fury. Warp storms represent some of the most feared phenomena in the Immaterium. These tempests of psychic energy can last for days, months, or centuries, cutting off entire sectors from the rest of the Imperium. Ships caught within warp storms face forces that dwarf any material phenomenon. The storm's energies tear at the fabric of reality itself, causing the Geller field to strain under impossible pressure. Navigators attempting to guide vessels through such turbulence often go mad from the effort, their minds unable to process the chaotic information flooding through their warp eye. The lucky ships emerge battered but intact, their crews traumatized but alive, arriving at destinations weeks or years off schedule. The unlucky ones are never seen again, presumed destroyed by forces that operate beyond human comprehension. The Great Rift that split the galaxy represents warp storms on an unprecedented scale. This massive tear in reality stretches across vast distances, effectively cutting the Imperium in half and making travel between the two sides nearly impossible. The Astronomican's light cannot penetrate the rift's furious energies, leaving navigators blind in regions where guidance is most desperately needed. Ships attempting to cross the rift face not merely death, but something far worse. The barrier between real space and the warp has worn so thin in these regions that demons can manifest even without Geller field failure. Entire fleets have vanished attempting the crossing, their fates unknown, their crews presumably suffering torments that the Imperium's chroniclers lack words to adequately describe. When a ship becomes lost in the warp, when it drifts beyond known routes and familiar currents, the crew faces a slow descent into horror that unfolds across days, weeks, or months, depending on how subjective time flows within their pocket of reality. The first sign comes from the navigators, who report that the Astronomican has faded beyond detection. This psychic lighthouse, powered by the Emperor's will and the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, serves as the primary navigational reference for all Imperial void travel. When its light vanishes from a navigator's perception, it means the ship has drifted into regions of the warp so distant or so turbulent that even that mighty beacon cannot reach. Without the Astronomican, the navigator must attempt to guide the ship using instinct and skill alone, following warp currents that might lead anywhere, hoping to eventually drift back within range of the Emperor's light. Food and water become critical concerns for crews lost in the warp. Ships carry supplies sufficient for expected journey times, plus reasonable margins for delay. But those supplies assume relatively predictable travel durations. When a vessel remains trapped in the Immaterium for months or years, starvation looms as a very real possibility. Crews implement rationing, stretching supplies as far as possible, but mathematics admits no mercy. Eventually the food runs out, water recyclers break down or become contaminated. Desperation drives people to consider options that would have seemed unthinkable during normal operations. Cannibalism emerges aboard some lost vessels, the crew preying upon their own dead, or even their weak, survival instinct overwhelming the last vestiges of civilized behavior. The isolation gnaws at psychological stability as surely as hunger gnaws at physical health. Crew members realize that no one knows their location, that rescue will never arrive, that they are truly alone in the most hostile environment imaginable. Even the machine spirit of the ship seems to sense the hopelessness, with systems developing inexplicable malfunctions, with corridors becoming unfamiliar despite decades of service, with sounds echoing through compartments that suggest the vessel itself has begun to transform under the warp's gradual influence. Some crew members retreat into religious fervour, praying to the Emperor with desperate intensity, believing that faith alone might deliver them from their predicament. Others abandon faith entirely, concluding that if the Emperor exists, he has clearly abandoned them to whatever fate awaits in the Immaterium's depths. The Geller field becomes an object of obsessive attention. Tech priests monitor its function constantly, performing maintenance rituals with trembling hands, knowing that even the slightest failure means immediate and horrible death for everyone aboard. They burn through psycho reserves at an alarming rate, installing fresh comatose minds into the field generators as quickly as the previous ones expire. Eventually those reserves dwindle. The moment approaches when the last backup cycle will be exhausted, when the Geller field will fail not through malfunction but through simple lack of fuel. Some tech priests volunteer to be placed in comas themselves, adding their dreams of reality to the shield that protects the ship, buying a few more hours or days of protection at the cost of their own lives. Meanwhile, the warp presses ever closer against the Geller field's boundaries, as if sensing the weakness within. Crew members report seeing faces in the walls, hearing voices that speak their names, experiencing nightmares that feel more real than waking life. The boundary between dreaming and consciousness begins to blur for those living in such proximity to the immaterium. Some wake from sleep to find they cannot move, paralyzed while shadow forms writhe at the edge of their vision. Others experience shared dreams, multiple crew members reporting identical visions of impossible landscapes or encounters with entities that promise salvation in exchange for small betrayals of faith or duty. Leadership aboard lost vessels begins to fracture under the combined pressure of starvation, isolation, and the constant threat of Geller field failure. Officers who once commanded respect through competence and discipline find their authority challenged by crew members driven to desperation. Mutinies erupt aboard some ships, with factions forming around charismatic individuals who promise salvation through alternative means. These promises often involve abandoning faith in the Emperor and seeking help from other sources that whisper promises through the walls, that appear in dreams wearing familiar faces that offer power and survival in exchange for what seems like such small prices. The Chaos Gods notice ships lost in the warp eventually. How could they not? These vessels represent concentrations of mortal souls adrift in the very realm that the ruinous powers dominate. To Khorne, they are potential warriors whose desperation might be channeled into rage. To Nurgle, they are suffering beings ripe for his particular brand of comfort. To Tzeentch, they represent countless possible futures to manipulate and schemes to weave. To Slaanesh, they are creatures experiencing extremes of sensation and emotion, their pain and pleasure equally appetizing. The Dark Gods do not typically intervene directly, not at first. They are patient in their own eternal way, allowing the natural pressures of being lost in the warp to do much of their work for them. Temptation comes gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. A crew member experiencing terrible hunger dreams of a feast and wakes to find a peculiar fungus growing in their quarters, edible and nourishing despite its disturbing appearance. Someone racked with pain from untreated injuries discovers that calling out to certain names in certain ways brings relief, though the relief comes with subtle changes to their flesh. An engineer struggling to maintain failing systems finds that machinery responds to symbols carved in specific patterns, symbols that seem to crawl across the metal of their own accord once inscribed. These small mercies seem like miracles to people who have been suffering for subjective months or years, and gratitude follows naturally from relief. Worship begins innocently enough in most cases. The starving crew who discovered the fungus start thanking the darkness that provided it. The injured who found relief through those whispered names begin reciting them as prayers. The engineer teaches others the symbols that make machines cooperate, and soon half the technical staff is carving them throughout the ship's systems. No one consciously decides to abandon the Emperor and embrace chaos. Rather, they take small steps towards survival, each step seeming reasonable in isolation, each compromise justified by desperate circumstances. Only later, when mutation becomes widespread and demonic entities walk openly through the corridors, do they realize how far they have traveled from anything resembling imperial orthodoxy. The mutations accelerate once worship begins in earnest. The Chaos Gods reward their new followers with changes that mark them as dedicated servants. These gifts, as they are euphemistically called, range from the subtle to the grotesque. A cornet worshipper might develop hardened skin that resists damage, along with eyes that glow red with barely contained rage. Those who pledge themselves to Nurgle find their bodies bloating with disease, yet simultaneously gaining immunity to pain and an unnatural resilience that allows them to survive injuries that should be fatal. Tzeentchian followers experience unpredictable changes, growing extra limbs or eyes, developing unnatural colours in their flesh, sometimes gaining psychic abilities they never possessed before. Slaaneshi cultists develop heightened senses that make every experience more intense, their flesh becoming preternaturally beautiful or horrifically scarred depending on the Dark Prince's whim. Physical changes represent only the most visible aspect of chaos corruption. The psychological alterations run deeper and prove far more permanent. Those who dedicate themselves to Khorne find that anger becomes their default emotional state, that violence is always the first solution that occurs to them, that they experience genuine joy only when inflicting or experiencing pain. Nurgle's followers develop a strange contentment with their deteriorating condition, finding beauty in decay, taking pride in the diseases they spread. They laugh at their own suffering, genuinely amused by the irony of finding happiness in horror. Tzeentch's worshippers become obsessed with change for its own sake, unable to accept any stable state, constantly scheming and plotting even when no purpose is served. Slanesh's devotees chase ever more extreme sensations, becoming incapable of experiencing satisfaction from normal pleasures, requiring excess in all things simply to feel anything at all. The ship itself changes alongside its crew. Vessels that have been lost in the warp long enough while housing Chaos worshippers begin to reflect the nature of their occupants. Metal walls develop organic textures, breathing in rhythm with some unheard heartbeat. Corridors reshape themselves into maze-like configurations that defy the ship's original schematics. Entire sections become possessed by demonic entities that merge with the vessel's structure, creating hybrid spaces where machine and demon are indistinguishable. The ship's machine spirit, if it ever truly existed as a discrete entity, becomes corrupted or consumed by something far worse, something that delights in the suffering of those still aboard who resist Chaos's influence. Not every crew member succumbs to corruption willingly. Aboard any lost vessel, pockets of resistance form around individuals of strong faith or iron will. These holdouts barricade themselves in sections of the ship that remain relatively uncorrupted, maintaining what fragments of discipline and imperial orthodoxy they can preserve. They fight running battles against former crewmates who have become cultists, executing those who show signs of mutation, burning entire compartments to cleanse them of demonic taint. These desperate defenders know they cannot win in any meaningful sense. They simply refuse to surrender, clinging to duty and faith even as their situation grows progressively more hopeless. The transformation of a lost ship into what might be called a demon vessel represents the ultimate fate of vessels that remain in the warp too long. At some point in the process, the distinction between ship and demon becomes meaningless. The vessel has become a semi-sentient entity in its own right, infused with the power of chaos, capable of existing in the warp without need for traditional Geller fields because it is fundamentally composed of warp stuff now. Its crew has either died, been absorbed into the ship's structure, or transformed into something that can no longer be called human. These demon ships roam the immaterium under their own malevolent will, occasionally emerging into real space to wreak havoc before vanishing back into the dimension from which they came. The Veritas Ferrum serves as a documented example of a ship's transformation into a demon vessel. Originally a strike cruiser of the Iron Hands Legion during the Horus Heresy, it escaped from the Istvan Vis massacre only to eventually fall to Chaos corruption. The vessel grew far larger than its original specifications, developing jaws, tentacles, and eyes across its hull. It became the flagship of a demon prince, leading a fleet of similar abominations in attacks across the galaxy. When last encountered during the Second Battle of Davin, it manifested above that cursed world, destroyed multiple Imperial vessels, and vanished back into the warp when its physical anchor was severed. Whether it still exists somewhere in the Immaterium, whether it can be destroyed by any conventional means, remains unknown. Some vessels lost in the warp never fall to Chaos corruption, but instead become what are classified as space hulks. These massive conglomerations of wrecked ships and debris drift through the Immaterium and occasionally translate back into real space at random locations. A space hulk might consist of dozens or hundreds of individual vessels that have somehow fused together over centuries or millennia, creating structures of staggering size and complexity. They accumulate additional wrecks each time they pass through regions of the warp where other ships have been destroyed, growing like macabre snowballs rolling through dimensions. The formation of space hulks follows patterns that remain poorly understood despite extensive study by the Adeptus Mechanicus. Ships that suffer catastrophic Geller field failure while in close proximity seem particularly prone to fusing together, as if the warp's energies weld them into single entities. Vessels that collide within the Immaterium merge rather than simply bouncing off each other or being destroyed by the impact. Some tech priests theorize that space hulks represent failed attempts by the warp itself to create something, though what purpose such creations might serve eludes rational analysis. Others suggest that space hulks are simply the natural result of entropy, operating in a dimension where physical laws function inconsistently. These drifting amalgamations represent both opportunity and threat to the Imperium. On one hand, they often contain technology from eras long past, including potentially functional standard template construct databases from the dark age of technology. The recovery of even partial STC data could revolutionize Imperial manufacturing capabilities, providing designs for weapons, vehicles, or infrastructure that have been lost for millennia. The Adeptus Mechanicus considers such recoveries worth almost any cost, viewing ancient technology with reverence that borders on religious devotion. On the other hand, space hulks frequently harbour hostile organisms or entities that pose existential threats to any world they approach. Genestealers infest space hulks with disturbing regularity. These Xenos creatures possess the ability to survive in the vacuum of space and can enter dormant states lasting centuries. A space hulk drifting through the void makes an ideal habitat for Genestealer broods, providing endless corridors to inhabit and occasional access to fresh victims when the hulk emerges near populated systems. The Genestealers establish elaborate nest complexes within the tangled wreckage, breeding and spreading throughout the structure, waiting patiently for the hulk's next translation into real space. When that occurs near an Imperial world, the consequences can prove catastrophic. Genestealers leave the hulk, infiltrate the population, and begin the slow process of establishing a cult that will eventually summon a Tyranid hive fleet to consume the planet entirely. Orcs use space hulks as their primary means of interstellar travel, finding them vastly preferable to constructing proper spacecraft. From the Orc perspective, space hulks represent ready-made vessels that require no maintenance and eventually arrive somewhere interesting where fighting can occur. Orc mobs board space hulks whenever they encounter them, establishing ramshackle settlements amid the wreckage, fighting among themselves when no external enemies present themselves, and simply waiting for the hulk to emerge from the warp near a world worth invading. The random nature of space hulk translations actually benefits Orc strategy, delivering them to locations where defenders have no warning of their approach and no time to prepare adequate resistance. The assault and clearance of space hulks falls to specialized Imperial forces, most notably Space Marine Terminators. These elite warriors, clad in ancient suits of tactical dreadnought armor, possess the firepower and protection necessary to survive the nightmare environments inside space hulks. They advance through pitch-black corridors where things could be lurking anywhere, where turning a corner might reveal a Genestealer brood, or an Orc mob, or something far worse. The Death of Integrity Space Hulk exemplifies the dangers inherent in such operations. 2 Space Marine chapters committed nearly 200 Terminators to clearing the hulk of Genestealers, only to discover that demons had also infested portions of the structure. At the hulk's centre, they found a Dark Age artificial intelligence that promptly attempted to hijack their vessels and flee to another galaxy. The Sin of Damnation represents perhaps the most infamous space hulk in Imperial records. It appears and disappears at irregular intervals, emerging from the warp in various locations across the galaxy. Blood Angel's Terminators have assaulted it multiple times, suffering terrible casualties each time they board its cursed corridors. The hulk seems almost alive in some malevolent sense, its internal configuration changing between appearances, its Genestealer inhabitants growing more numerous and dangerous with each encounter. Some scholars theorize that the Sin of Damnation exists simultaneously in multiple time periods, that boarding parties from different eras might theoretically encounter each other within its depths, though such speculation verges on the heretical. Ships that become lost in the warp but somehow avoid both chaos corruption and incorporation into space hulks face the challenge of eventually finding their way back to real space. This proves exponentially more difficult without a functional navigator or access to the Astronomican's guiding light. Some vessels drift for subjective centuries, their crews dying of old age or being born, living, and dying across multiple generations. These generational ships develop their own isolated cultures, their occupants forgetting the purpose of their voyage, sometimes forgetting that a universe exists beyond the vessel's hull. When such ships finally emerge from the warp, their crews often cannot comprehend or accept the reality they find waiting for them. The phenomenon of temporal displacement creates particularly tragic scenarios. Ships that entered the warp during one era emerge centuries or millennia later into a galaxy they no longer recognize. The crew might have experienced only months subjectively, while thousands of years passed in real space. They return to find that the Imperium they served has changed beyond recognition, that the worlds they left behind have been destroyed or colonized by Xenos, that everyone they knew died generations ago. Some crews refuse to accept this reality, clinging to the belief that they can somehow return to their proper time, that what they are experiencing must be a warp-induced hallucination rather than objective truth. One documented case involves a vessel that emerged from the warp 20,000 years after its departure, originating from the dark age of technology itself. The ship carried technology that made it invaluable to the Adeptus Mechanicus, though what became of its crew remains classified in inquisitorial records. One can imagine the horror of those crew members departing from an era of human prosperity and technological mastery, only to return and find humanity locked in an eternal war against forces they cannot possibly understand. Whether the Mechanicus executed them, inducted them into the priesthood, or disposed of them through some other means, official records make no mention of their fate beyond the recovery of the vessel itself. Warp storms represent another major hazard for ships attempting to return to real space. These massive disturbances in the immaterium can persist for centuries, isolating entire sectors from the rest of the galaxy. The Great Rift that split the Imperium in half exemplifies warp storms on a catastrophic scale. This wound in reality makes traditional warp travel nearly impossible across vast regions, with the Astronomican's light unable to penetrate its furious energies. Ships caught within the rift when it formed found themselves trapped, unable to navigate, unable to call for help, slowly dying as supplies dwindled and hope faded. Those that attempted to escape often emerged in locations far from their intended destinations, assuming they emerged at all rather than being destroyed by the rift's unimaginable forces. The psychology of crews who do eventually return to real space after extended periods lost in the warp presents unique challenges for Imperial authorities. These survivors have experienced things that most humans cannot imagine and should not know about. They have looked into the abyss, and the abyss has looked back, leaving permanent scars on their psyches. The Inquisition takes immediate interest in any vessel that returns from extended warp exposure, sending agents to interview every survivor, searching for signs of corruption or forbidden knowledge. In most cases, the entire crew is executed as a precautionary measure. The risk of chaos taint spreading through the general population outweighs any value the survivors might possess as witnesses to their ordeal. Some few individuals prove resilient enough to survive both the experience of being lost in the warp and the subsequent inquisitorial investigation. These rare souls possess either iron faith that protected them from corruption, or simply psychological constitutions hardy enough to endure exposure to the Immaterium's horrors without breaking. The Inquisition sometimes recruits such individuals, recognizing that anyone who survived months or years adrift in the warp has demonstrated useful qualities. Other survivors are mind-wiped, their memories of the experience erased through psychic surgery, then return to service in roles where they cannot share what they once knew. The kindness of such treatment remains debatable, as many mind-wiped individuals report persistent nightmares and vague feelings of dread despite having no conscious memory of their ordeal. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches the problem of ships lost in the warp from a purely technical perspective, seeking to develop systems that might prevent such losses or facilitate recovery. They have experimented with improved Gellerfield designs, though each innovation seems to introduce new failure modes. The Bellican pattern, Gellerfield for instance, offered enhanced performance, but suffered from an inexplicable flicker during prolonged use, creating moments when demons could breach the field. Such experiments usually end poorly, validating the conservative approach that dominates most Imperial technical development. Better to use proven designs, even with their known limitations, than to risk innovations that might prove catastrophically worse. Attempts to create automated distress beacons that function in the warp have similarly met with failure. The nature of the Immaterium disrupts conventional communication methods, and psychic beacons attract exactly the sort of attention ships lost in the warp desperately wish to avoid. Some tech priests theorize that quantum entanglement might provide a solution, allowing ships to communicate instantaneously across any distance without using the warp as a medium. However, the theoretical principles remain beyond current Imperial understanding, lost along with so much other knowledge from the dark age of technology. The Mechanicus continues its research, driven by the conviction that the Omnissiah surely provided solutions to all technical problems, if only humanity could rediscover them. Certain individuals within the Imperium possess uncommon knowledge about surviving extended exposure to the warp. Rogue traders, who operate on the fringes of known space and frequently venture beyond the Astronomican's reach, develop strategies for navigating without that guiding light. They cultivate relationships with particularly skilled navigators, maintain extensive star charts marking relatively stable warp routes, and often employ Xenos guides who possess alternative navigation methods. The Inquisition monitors rogue traders closely, suspicious of anyone who operates too successfully in regions where Imperial orthodoxy holds little sway. Some rogue traders have undoubtedly made pacts with Chaos entities to facilitate their travels, selling their souls for safe passage through the Immaterium, though proving such heresy remains difficult when the accused operates far from Imperial authority. The question of whether ships can navigate the warp safely without navigators or the Astronomicon admits complicated answers. The Tau have developed drives that allow brief skimming along the warp surface without fully entering it, achieving faster-than-light travel without exposing their crews to the Immaterium's full horrors. Their approach sacrifices speed for safety, taking months to cover distances that Imperial vessels cross in weeks, but it functions reliably even in regions where warp storms rage. However, recent Tau experiments with true warp drives ended catastrophically when they attempted to reverse engineer Imperial technology without understanding the necessity of Geller fields. The fourth sphere of expansion fleet that entered the warp unprotected was nearly annihilated, with survivors experiencing horrors that fundamentally changed Tau understanding of the universe's true nature. The Eldar navigate using the Webway, an ancient network of tunnels through the warp created by the Old Ones millions of years ago. This method allows them to travel vast distances without exposing themselves to the Immaterium's raw chaos. Craft worlds, the massive vessels housing Eldar populations, move through real space itself rather than risking warp travel, though they do so with agonizing slowness from a human perspective. When Eldar must use the warp directly, they do so with extreme caution, employing psychic disciplines and technologies that humanity cannot replicate. Even with these advantages, Eldar ships occasionally become lost in the Immaterium, and the fates of their crews differ little from what befalls lost human vessels. The Leagues of Votan employ Geller field technology superior to Imperial designs, with their Geller ramparts offering enhanced reliability during warp travel. Their Ironkin wayfinders, artificial intelligences specialized in navigation, guide vessels through the Immaterium using calculated short jumps rather than the longer transits Imperial ships attempt. This conservative approach takes longer but results in far fewer ships being lost to warp-related accidents. The Votan view Imperial warp travel practices with something approaching contempt, considering the unnecessary risks taken by human vessels, evidence of typical human inefficiency and poor resource management. For the individual crew member trapped aboard a ship lost in the warp, the experience transcends mere physical danger or even death. It represents a fundamental assault on everything they understand about reality, morality, and their place in the universe. They entered the warp as loyal servants of the Imperium, believing in the Emperor's protection, trusting in technology and training to see them through. They emerge, if they emerge at all, having witnessed truths that the Imperial Creed works desperately to suppress. They know now that gods exist, that demons are real, that the universe contains forces which view humanity as little more than food or entertainment. This knowledge cannot be unlearned, cannot be forgotten, cannot be reconciled with the comfortable lies most Imperial citizens accept without question. The survivors carry invisible scars that never heal. They flinch at shadows, see faces in static, hear whispers in white noise. They know that the Geller field protecting them is a fragile barrier, that machine spirits might be something far worse than anyone admits, that every warp jump carries the risk of experiencing again what they endured during those lost days or months or years. Some become religious zealots, embracing faith with desperate intensity, hoping that absolute conviction might protect them where technology clearly failed. Others become cynics, seeing the Imperium's claims as propaganda designed to keep the masses compliant, understanding that humanity survives not through the Emperor's protection, but through sheer numerical superiority and a willingness to sacrifice billions for marginal strategic gains. The broader implications of ships regularly being lost in the warp shape Imperial military and economic planning in fundamental ways. Supply lines must account for an expected percentage of vessels simply never arriving at their destinations. Military operations cannot rely on reinforcements appearing on schedule, as warp travel times vary unpredictably even under optimal conditions. Entire sectors occasionally become isolated when warp storms cut them off from the rest of the Imperium, forced to survive on their own resources for decades or centuries until the storms abate. This uncertainty pervades every level of Imperial administration, creating a civilization that operates despite rather than because of its primary method of interstellar travel. Alternatives to warp travel remain either impractical or unavailable to humanity. Conventional sublight travel would take centuries to cross even relatively short interstellar distances, rendering any form of galactic civilization impossible. The webway that served the Eldar so well remains inaccessible to humanity despite the Emperor's attempts to master it during the Great Crusade. Necron inertialess drives and Tyranid bioship capabilities exist beyond human comprehension, relying on principles that Imperial tech priests cannot even begin to reverse engineer. Humanity is stuck with warp travel, accepting its terrible costs as the price of maintaining a galactic presence, knowing that every journey might become a one-way trip into literal hell. The ships still drift out there, lost in the Immaterium's infinite depths. Vessels that departed decades or centuries ago, their crews long dead or transformed into things that mock human form, their hulls corrupted by energies that should not exist in real space. Some will eventually emerge, bringing horror to whatever systems they appear within. Others will wander the warp eternally, never finding their way back to the material universe, trapped forever in a dimension that exists beyond time and space as mortals comprehend them. The Imperium catalogues each loss, records each disappearance, and sends forth more ships to meet the same potential fate. Because the alternative is to abandon the galaxy to humanity's enemies. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and war requires logistics. Those logistics depend on ships traversing the warp, on crews willing to risk becoming lost in that nightmare realm, on the acceptance that some significant percentage of vessels will simply vanish without explanation. The Imperium cannot function without warp travel, yet warp travel creates an endless stream of casualties that never appear in official records as combat losses. They are simply listed as overdue, presumed lost, acceptable wastage in service to the Emperor. For those who board a ship knowing it will travel through the warp, the statistics offer cold comfort. Perhaps their vessel will complete its journey without incident, emerging at the intended destination after subjective weeks of travel. Perhaps they will arrive to find decades or centuries have passed, everyone they knew long dead, the universe transformed beyond recognition. Perhaps the Geller field will fail and demons will flood through the ship, offering rewards in exchange for worship, granting mutations as blessings, consuming souls for sustenance. Perhaps they will become part of a space hulk, their ship fusing with others into a conglomeration that drifts through dimensions for millennia. Or perhaps they will simply vanish, becoming one more missing vessel on some administrator's list, never to be heard from again. The warp permits no mercy, offers no salvation, recognizes no appeals to fairness or justice. It is a dimension fundamentally hostile to biological life, where consciousness itself becomes vulnerability, where thought and emotion attract predators that exist beyond conventional reality. Ships that become lost in the warp discover this truth in the most visceral way possible, learning lessons that cannot be shared because the knowledge itself corrupts those who possess it. The survivors who return carry warnings that cannot be spoken, bearing witness to horrors that must remain classified, serving as living reminders of the price humanity pays for every light year crossed using the Immaterium's cursed tides. The wheel turns, the ships depart, some arrive, others vanish. The cycle continues because it must, because the alternative means the slow death of human civilization across 10,000 isolated systems, each dwindling into extinction without support from the greater Imperium. So the ships continue jumping into the warp despite knowing the risks. Crews continue volunteering for duty despite understanding they might never return, and the Imperium accepts these losses as the inevitable cost of survival in a universe that offers no safety, no certainty, only war without end, and the slim hope that tomorrow might bring something better than today's nightmare. Hope that consistently proves false, yet persists nonetheless, because what else remains?